here to enjoy this amazing, incredible, mystical space for a second time. I was here a few years ago, and spoke to a small gathering as well. And it's nice to see new stuff coming in and all sorts of. It's like a living place, and it shows. Yeah, and I love how it shows in various facets this theme of human unity in many unexpected ways. I don't know really where to start because I don't know all of you personally, and so I just have to, I guess, pick kind of a random starting point and see where that goes, and maybe leave plenty of time at the end for conversation. My theme is the unity of science and religion, of the material and spiritual dimensions of existence, and an idea which I'll call the circle of existence. And I'm coming in from a science background, and it's from that perspective, I suppose, that I'll pick a starting point, which one sociologist of religion has called a landscape of smoldering ruins, which is one way to describe what remains of religious belief for many people in the modern age, in the wake of what has been an incredible several centuries in human civilization, incredible in many great ways and incredible in many terrible ways. The openings that have resulted from our rediscovery of the scientific method, our discovery of a new way of probing the universe, of understanding how things work, of understanding in every detail the processes of the physical world, have led humanity to incredible heights of civilization, of control of our environment, of reduction of disease, of the lengthening of human lifespans, of intercommunication globally, of our ability to begin to explore even beyond our own planet, are all amazing accomplishments of technology. At the same time, we are in the midst of a kind of landscape of smoldering ruins, in the case that this advance in our physical understanding of the world has come at the cost of the destruction of much that went before, much human culture, much religious belief, belief in the spiritual nature of the world, belief in God or various kinds of gods, which acted in so many ways as the glue holding societies together, defining people, defining communities in many positive and negative ways. But it's like the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater, in a way, that we've emptied the tub of all of this, all of the past ways of thinking about the world spiritually, thinking about the world as interconnected, thinking about the world that helps to bring people together and to see individual human beings as sacred and of value in and of themselves. And those are positive elements of old ways of thinking, which have really been undermined and replaced by a paradigm, a materialistic paradigm, which sees the world essentially as comprised of atoms and the void, bouncing around in space, doing their thing according to mathematical laws, out of which our appearance at this particular moment in time is best described as a massive accident. The best that the materialistic scientific paradigm can do to explain the existence of life and consciousness is to say, well, the universe is a really big place. It's really old. There's a lot of stuff in it, and it's all mixing and remixing, and there's a lot of energy flowing around here and there, and that gives us enough time and enough space for random things to happen. And guess what? We're one of those random things, and that's fundamentally how the present scientific picture of the world sees our existence here, and it sees the appearance of life on Earth and the evolution of life on Earth as also part of this grand accident driven by these inexorable physical forces that driven by competition and natural selection and essentially blind forces that in one way I'm not saying that the evolutionary picture of the world is fundamentally false, but the way we understand it tends to devalue the individual. It tends to drain the world of the significances that previously upheld it. Drains the world of the sense of the sacredness and value of the individual. And so that's trying to set a bit of a scene of where we are now. There's amazing things happening. Technology is still racing ahead. Our ability to understand our world seems to be on this non-stop train towards ever expanding mastery, and that's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, we have this problem, which is now manifesting itself in so many ways in the political domain, in the social domain, of a kind of disintegration, disintegration of so much of what bound society together in the past. Now we're facing increasing polarization of various kinds, driven by social media and mass media, all kinds of interest, money interest, and so forth, all of which without some sort of backing that sees humanity in a different kind of collective or sacred light, ultimately is going to continue on this road to fragmentation and conflict that we're on. And so the real question of the hour, the need for the hour, is how can we recover our sense of the sacred in a world in which the sacred seems to have been drained out of? How can we recover the sense of spirit, which for so long was at the core of humanity's self-understanding? And what I want to propose and sketch in very, very brief outline is not an argument to return to old ways of thinking. The way forward is not backwards. We cannot unring the bell that has been rung by our discovery of the scientific method and our discovery of so much about the world, which makes so much of our previous beliefs, exposes them as superstitions of various kinds. We can't return to a superstitious age. So the question is, how do we move forward and find a rebirth of spirituality in a way that that fully embraces the reality of the world that we know that we inhabit, a world that follows certain mathematical patterns which have been explored, have been in great detail, sometimes out to 12 decimal points, is the degree of precision of some of our scientific experiments against the theory. In some realms, when it comes, for example, to quantum mechanics, our understanding of it has reached such a degree, and the comparison with the actual world that we inhabit is so close that that there's effectively no question that this theory is correct. So the big question is, how can we find a rebirth of spirituality in a world in which our scientific understanding of the world is not going to go away, and we don't want it to go away. is there a way to understand the last few centuries of progress in the material sphere, not as a turning back away from spirit, but as part of the spiritual story of the human race. To see the advance of science and our increasing grasp of our physical world as part of the spiritual evolution of the human race. And that's where we get into this idea of a circle of existence. When we look at the world, and my starting point from this point will be actually a talk that Abdul Baha, the son of the founder of the Baha'i Faith, gave in 1912. I believe this talk was given at Stanford University. Actually, he spoke at Stanford in October of 1912. And in this talk, he says that that one of the fundamental principles of what he calls divine philosophy, and what I'm going to talk about, I believe is at least one take at this divine philosophy Abdul Baha was talking about. The fundamental fact of it is our observance of life and death as being sort of fundamental to our experience. When we look around us, we see life and death in a constant struggle. We see life in the cycles of life and death, from the smallest creatures to our own selves, to human civilizations themselves, to, on the planetary scale, to the life and death of planets and the suns that they orbit. Everything seems to move in cycles or circles. They moved up to a certain point of maximal physical efflorescence, and then there's a period of decline, and then it recycles back to the beginning. This is a fact of our universe, which is only half explained by our present scientific paradigm. Our present scientific paradigm does an incredible job of describing how things work at the micro level, the microscopic level, does a fantastic job of explaining how things work when it comes to the macroscopic level of, planets orbiting stars, the formation of galaxies and black holes and so forth. My own research was in the origin of structure in the universe and the masses of nearby galaxies. And it turns out that the masses of our nearby galaxies can be amazingly well predicted by a few simple mathematical principles. This is at a scale far beyond our sun and our planets. It's our galaxy and nearby galaxies. All of them obey very simple mathematical laws. And everything in the universe, from the very small to the very large, seems to obey these simple laws. So if you want to ask, in this following situation, what's going to happen, you have a way of predicting what's going to happen for any given situation. And this ability of science to describe in detail everything that we observe has been taken, it has been understood to gradually crowd out other explanations of the world, which we might call spiritual, what some might call superstitious. Why is it that the seasons came this year a little bit late? Well, it's because the god of the harvest, was not propitiated with the proper sacrifices. Why did lightning strike this particular building? For natural processes, there were explanations that invoked the supernatural at every turn. Back in the old days, up to a few centuries ago, everything that happened had some sort of spiritual explanation, or there was some sort of God involved, or there was some sort of divine intention involved. And as the progress of science continued to explain more and more of what we saw and experienced, it seemed as though less and less space existed for the realm of the spiritual. It got crowded out. Because the way we thought about God, the way we thought about the spiritual, is what has been termed in science and religion discourse as the God of the gaps. People thought of spirit, people thought of God as being, that invisible being or beings that acted in the gaps of our knowledge. So yeah, we understand now wave water action, and we understand the sun and the seasons and the tilt of the earth producing the seasons and all of that. So we don't need to have the god of the harvest anymore, because we understand why it is that the harvest comes on a regular basis, and what makes summer a little bit different from winter and so forth. And so that god gets booted out of our, of our understanding of things. And then, gradually, one by one, our understanding of the world as as filled with spirit and spiritual forces gets replaced with an understanding of the world in which purely physical processes are the end all be all explanations of everything. And I don't want to suggest that it's not the case that if we set up any experiment in any laboratory, that at some point these laws of physics are going to fail because we didn't take into account some spiritual force. I'm not going to suggest that. I'm going to suggest something else, which is that what we call spirit is something that operates at let's say, longer time scales than instantaneous time scales of things that we observe in the laboratory. Spirit is manifested in the progress of matter itself. Spirit is manifested in the emergence of planets and protoplanetary disks from the remnants of the previous generations of dying stars, and the coalescence of those protoplanetary disks into planets with the capability of sustaining life on them. And furthermore, spirit is manifested when the initial building blocks of life form on the surfaces of those planets through natural processes, through the processes of the input of energy from its nearby star, and from the motion of water and all of the things that happen on the surface of a planet. And spirit is also manifest in the emergence of those first life forms that currently science has no way of explaining, except appealing to this enormous black box of time and space and matter, and saying, well, there's enough randomness in the universe to account for this. But there is as yet no explanation for how life emerges. It's still a mystery. And I think spirit also is there in the evolution of those unicellular life forms to beings of gradually increasing complexity over hundreds of millions, even billions of years, gradually increasing in their complexity in a way that seems to unlock higher and higher degrees of consciousness. At first, it's just that little photosensitive spot in a unicellular creature, but then that unicellular creature comes together until millions of single-celled organisms are functioning as one organism, and then that allows for the differentiation of certain cells, and that eye spot becomes an actual eye. Over millions of generations of trial and error, of genetic errors and codes, becoming accidentally, perhaps, becoming conducive of better survival. And so over time you have the emergence of power, let's call them powers and capacities. The ability to move at first is one great capacity that life didn't eventually have. You needed to evolve, if you're a single cellular life form, some sort of rotor with a tail that can spin around. Or if you're multicellular, you have to evolve muscles that can move, and you have to evolve a nervous system that can direct that motion so that it can move in the direction of the food or the light or whatever it needs to survive. But all of these, I will argue, are spiritual powers, broadly speaking. So I'm starting at the Big Bang, really, and the evolution of stars and planets billions of years ago, and I'm suggesting a narrative of the cosmos in which at first the substrate of life emerges, and then life itself emerges, and then over millions and billions of years conscious life emerges. As far as we know, really, first of all, in our own mammalian line, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years ago. We have no evidence of conscious life existing on this planet before that. We can't exclude it. It hasn't left any traces that we can say for sure. And of course, we don't know anything about conscious life itself, or conscious life on other planets, in our own solar system, or in the nearly and possibly infinite number of other planets and systems beyond that of our own. I will further suggest that spirit continues to manifest itself beyond the emergence of consciousness in individual specimens such as us, human beings, who have this amazing power of the mind to grasp the world, and this amazing power of reflection, which seems to reach its height in self-reflection, of self-consciousness, which is a key to the circle of existence, which I'll get to in a moment. But our evolution goes beyond that of us individually to include us collectively. Just as individual cells come together and evolve to form multicellular organisms, which is part of the story of evolution, so also human beings come together, not physically joined, but mentally and spiritually joined, in ways to create families, tribes, city-states, nations. We can see the evolution of that in human history, hyper-evolution of that over the last few thousand years, where we can say history really begins, maybe with the the paintings on the walls of caves discovered in parts of Europe. The first real evidence, aside from burials with flowers and with bodies positioned in certain ways or oriented in certain ways, these are some of the earliest evidences that there was consciousness, and perhaps even consciousness is something which we might call the sacred, that existed many tens of thousands of years ago. But what we see in the last few thousand years is this turn in evolution, which really, in which it seems to feed upon it. It creates this positive feedback loop in which the evolution just gets more and more rapid with every cycle. And we're now at this point where in our lifetimes we have experienced incredible pace of evolution of human society, primarily driven by technology, which has brought the world so much closer together in terms of our ability to physically travel places, and through the internet, our ability to communicate with people around the world on a moment-by-moment basis. All of this is part of, you can draw a line almost from the moment of the Big Bang to this emergence of a nascent global civilization on the planet, which is going through immense birth pangs. There are those who have this vision of humanity as approaching the next stage of its evolution by the recognition of its organic oneness, which will unlock such powers and capacities that now we can barely imagine, because so much of human energy and power and resources at this point in our history is devoted towards some form of conflict, and it's essentially canceled out. When this tribe battles this tribe, or this political party battles this political party, it's almost as though 98% of all the energy gets dissipated through that friction, and the remaining 2% thrusts us forward in the next. Because these votes are always 51% one party and 49% the other party, and it's almost as though that on that tiny margin represents the net motion forward of human society. But what I want to suggest is that this line of cosmic evolution, which seems to be in the direction of the upbuilding of matter from the first planets to life to consciousness to civilizations, is all in a direction of increasing complexity and increasing spirit. Abdu'l-Baha said that spirit is or progress rather, is the expression of spirit in the realm of matter. It's a basic definition that helps orient my thinking about all of this. Progress, and I think by progress, he's not just talking about civilization's progress over the next couple centuries, but the progress of the cosmos, including the emergence and evolution of life billions of years in the past, and including the further progress into the untold expanse of the future, that this whole narrative of progress that I'm presenting is the expression of spirit in the realm of matter. But that's only half of the circle of existence. I suggested earlier that science has only figured out half of the story, and what I've just proposed is what the other half of the story is. And the two halves of the story can be thought of as what Abdu'l-Baha calls, again, I'm really appealing to the thinking of Abdu'l-Baha, and in particular the talks he gave in the West, at Stanford and in other places in the early part of the last century, what Abdu'l-Baha called arcs of descent and ascent. And it's a beautiful image which we can think of as a narrative. We can think of it as a sacred narrative. How do we evaluate whether it's true or not that this is how to describe the cosmos at the largest scale? Well, ultimately, we don't have access to ultimate reality. So all we can say is, well, does this work as a narrative? Does this narrative help in some way? So that's all we can really say. So I will suggest that a helpful narrative is this narrative that Abdu'l-Baha introduces. And the narrative is that creation on the largest scales comprises two fundamental processes: the arc of descent and the arc of ascent. He says the arc of descent ends in material realities and the arc of ascent in spiritual realities. So one way to think about science and religion is science represents what's, the exposition and unfolding of the various stages of the arc of descent, and religion represents the various stages and progress along the arc of ascent. Another way of thinking about this, and this actually comes from Alfred North Whitehead, a great philosopher of the early 20th century, you can think of the first half of this circle as the realm of what was the word he used? It's the realm of coercion. In other words, everything has to follow these laws. It's the realm of science, of physics, there are laws of physics and all matter follows these laws. If you set up a laboratory experiment, you're always going to get this result based on these laws. There isn't some invisible, mystical, spiritual force reaching in its hand and causing a difference. We have to think about spirit differently, because there's no evidence of these sorts of gaps in our detailed knowledge of the universe. Science seems to have filled the gaps in that sense. Instead, what we see is, on the large scale, we see life and death. On the largest scales, we see what science has well described as the force of entropy. I'm using force in quotation marks because it's not a force in the same sense as electromagnetism is a force. Entropy is a process that guarantees that over time, disorder will increase. Guarantees. It's a rock solid result of all of the work of scientists over centuries. That, another way to put it, that heat always flows from a hot place to a cold place. Heat will never flow from a cold place to a hot place. Of course, we have refrigerator units, but they are not breaking the laws of entropy. They're actually generating a lot more heat than the cold that they're pumping into a particular room. On the largest scales, draw a boundary over any a large enough space, and the disorder in that space is always going to increase. That's death. Disorder is death. But what we see in the world is not just death. And all science can really tell us, all the laws of physics can really tell us about how things are going to evolve in the large scale is entropy increases. That's all. That's half of the circle of existence. The other half of the circle is life. We look around us, and actually most of what we see, or a big chunk of what we see, take a walk in the forest, these are living things. These are things that are not getting more and more disordered. These are not things that are dead. Some of them are dead and dying. Some of them, most of the things that we see on a walk in the forest are alive. They're flourishing. They're actually moving the opposite direction from what we would expect from entropy. And again, I'm not suggesting that the law of entropy is false. And I'm not suggesting that at some micro level there are invisible spiritual forces moving this atom or that atom, or pushing this object in this direction or that direction. But rather, just like entropy comes in when you look at the behavior of a system over time, the spiritual evolution of things, progress, what Abdu'l-Baha said is the expression of spirit in the realm of matter, acts in as a complement to this force of entropy, which is the thing that upbuilds, as yet undiscovered by science. There's no scientific theory for why you should have decreasing entropy in certain regions of space. Scientists can appeal to, say, chaos theory and to nonlinear systems, and look at turbulent flows and so forth, and they can say, well, there's space for temporarily in certain regimes where you have like energy pouring into a system, there's space for entropy to go down temporarily in this little bubble, but over time entropy is going to go up, and so life here on Earth is not directly violating the law of entropy, because there's space for it to happen. But one has to ask, and this is where I think one takes a fork in the road, and one makes a decision: is it more likely that life and consciousness is an accident with ultimately nothing to explain it but chance and time and space and matter? Or is looking at the universe as we see it, and looking at what we know of cosmic evolution, and looking at what we know of life on Earth and how life progressed on Earth, is it more likely that we're missing something? We're missing some countervailing tendency that complements entropy, that completes the circle of existence. In other words, that we understand matter and the material world very well, and we understand that looking only at matter in the material world, the best we can come up with in terms of what's going on the large scale is entropy and disorder going. But we also, when we experience the world as human beings, and when we look at the evolution of cosmic history and the evolution of life on this planet, it seems as though there's something countervailing that force that tends to increase disorder. There's something that tends to increase order. We can either say, well, that's all just a big accident, or we can say there's something that we haven't yet figured out. More things on heaven and earth than exist in your philosophy, dear Horatio, as Shakespeare says. And that thing, let us call it spirit, or let's call it consciousness, or let's call it's a word, and by assigning it a word, I'm entering into a dialogue with this group or that group, or it's automatically going to be subsumed under this or that religious doctrine or whatever. But so let's just say there's a word for it, and probably the most common word for it that here in the West, in this particular location and time, that word would probably be spirit. And it's matter and spirit that collectively complete that circle of existence. And what is happening in the circle of existence? Why is it a circle? Here we come to what I mentioned before, self-consciousness, as being something very special in the evolution of life on this planet. That with humans, as far as we know, for the first time you have emergence of life that isn't just capable of propagating itself and controlling its environment to the extent that it can reproduce itself before it itself dies, but it's somehow capable of turning back on itself and reflecting upon its own self, and wondering and asking, where did I come from, and what's the purpose of this all? And this act of self-reflection is, for Abdu'l-Baha, and for the Baha'i writings in general, I will submit the central sort of spiritual process of creation. That is the spiritual pathway that we're all on, whether we admit it or not, whether we think of it in this way or not. The culmination of our spiritual existence lies in our full self-realization, which is different for everybody and different from one culture to the next, and is expressed differently from one religion to the next, but all of them share the same fundamental idea that self-realization, which in the end is the same as divine realization is the goal of the spiritual path. I slipped something really kind of profound in there, that self-realization is the same as divine realization. And a lot of the mystics throughout history have gotten in big trouble for saying this. Because if you just say it without context, it's going to sound like something like, I am God. And in a kind of egotistical sense. And that's not where this is going. This is going in a very different place. It's going in a place in which the largest picture of the universe and the thing that drives the circle in both of the arcs, whether it's the arc of coercion, and I have to finish that thought. The arc of descent is coercion. Everything must go from point to point, run by the laws of physics, mathematically certain, precise. You can't undo those laws. So half of the circle is coercion. The other half of the circle, and this is the idea of Alfred North Whitehead, is persuasion. To sort of traverse the second half of the journey, you cannot be forced to do it. You have to be persuaded to do it. And the idea is that this turn from force to persuasion represents the signal advance of human consciousness over the last few thousand years. If you look at human history, how do people run governments? And Whitehead looks at the Roman Empire. He says, look at the Roman Empire. How did the Roman Empire run? It ran on the backs of slaves. The only thing that could have made this thing work was you had an aristocracy at the top. You had the emperor, of course. You had a few people at the top, and you had this massive population of slaves that are actually running the plantations, building the roads, maintaining that civilization. And that was the highest state that civilization could achieve under this paradigm of force being the ultimate rule of things. And it wasn't until in Whitehead's sort of analysis of history that you have the Christian revelation coming along. But more generally, he actually gives more credit to the Greeks even than the Christians at introducing the idea, and he gives full credit actually to Plato's Timaeus. So one of the dialogues of Plato, the dialogue called the Timaeus, talks about creation and Plato's theory of how creation came into being, which is kind of fantastical and has all sorts of weird ideas in it. But the thing that Whitehead zeroes in on, which I think is really brilliant, is he saw that what Plato was describing as significant was the turn in creation was moving from coercion to persuasion, that ultimately creation came about, and the highest degree of creation came about only through the free act of will of the created. So and this is the second half of the circle of existence. So the one half of the circle, the material world, the material realm, is the realm of physical laws, mathematical certainties. Of course, mediated by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and all that fancy stuff from quantum mechanics. But the overall picture is one of set physical laws as a framework within which all things have to operate. The second half is this arc of persuasion, that human civilization takes this turn. And this turn, from the Roman Empire to, say, this efflorescence of modern democracies, with all of their colonialist proclivities and all of the continuance of chattel slavery and so forth, that continues horrifically until almost the modern age. You at least have this idea of persuasion being at the heart of government. And by extension, persuasion being more at the heart of existence itself. That we traverse that second arc and we return back to the source only through a free act of will. Religion, in this sense, cannot be coercive. It must be persuasive. When we follow a religion, we talk about religious laws, but really it's all through a free act of will that we follow these things. We can think of these laws as just as ineluctable as the physical laws of nature, but the reality is we individually follow these laws as an act of love, not as an act of coercion, and that's how the remainder of that arc of ascent is traversed. And then in doing so, what we've done is we've recapitulated sort of what happens at a microcosmic and a macrocosmic level throughout creation. It's like Russian dolls. You crack one open and there's one inside that, and you crack that open and there's one inside that. It's this process of observer and observed realizing that they're one. It's the process of the subject and the object realizing that this distinction between subject and object is, and has always been, at best, a useful approximation, which gets you a certain distance, but if you want to go the whole distance, that subject-object distinction has to be let go of. The distinction between the soul, what we think of as our soul, the ultimate subject, and everyone else around us and our whole environment around us, and the God that we worship, all of those in the position of object, all of that has to be let go of. And the mystical journey is precisely the process of traversing this circle of existence through all the various stages, where you begin with our natural inclination of seeing the world as resolved into different objects, and seeing ourselves as one object among many, competing with other objects to get stuff or do whatever you do when you're living. Traversing the stages of realization that go from that very natural, given to us by evolution, way of looking at the world, competition between stuff, until one by one, as it were, the veils are torn away, and we are left with a realization that what lies within us is a ray of the divine light. And this is summarized by Baha'u'llah in one of his hidden words. He says, "Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting." That, in a word, is a recapitulation of this circle of existence that Abdu'l-Baha talks about in his lecture at Stanford University. This is how creation comes into being, through a recursive act of self-observation. And this isn't just a theological idea that somehow it all comes to this recognition of one's own divinity and one's own creative power as being central to existence. It's also found, very interestingly, in some of the ideas of that have attempted to marry quantum mechanics with cosmology. One of the great physicists of the middle 20th century, John Wheeler, he was in his last years at Princeton when I was there, and he's probably best known among, although not known by name, but he's best known for coining the phrase black hole. He also, in his later years, thought a lot about the Big Bang and quantum mechanics, and how did the Big Bang come into being? This is one of those big question marks. And since the Big Bang represents this initial moment of infinite density and infinite energy, all the equations break down. You can't put infinities into a mathematical equation. So it's left the field quite wide open to all kinds of speculation about how the Big Bang might have come to being. Was there a bang before it? Or are there other parallel bangs? Are there multiverses or multiple universes? And all sorts of cool stuff, but there's no real evidence for it. And one thing that Wheeler suggested, and again, without evidence yet, but it's a very interesting idea, is that just as in quantum mechanics, in a quantum mechanical system, it exists in a superposition, a mathematical superposition of possibilities until it's observed, at which point that superposition somehow resolves into the actual thing. A light wave is literally, it's a wave of possibilities until you put a photographic plate down and capture that magnetic wave in one single photon, which hits that photographic plate at a certain point in time. Before that photon was registered on your photographic plate, light was described as a wave. But then when it's measured, it becomes a particle. So this has been described ad nauseum in all sorts of in all kinds of articles, designed for public consumption about quantum mechanics, the weirdness of quantum mechanics. So John Wheeler took this idea and said, well, what if we apply this to the universe? He said, well, maybe what brought the Big Bang into being was it got observed. Just like any quantum mechanical system, something had to observe it. But his next step was not, oh, well, God observed it, or some outside observer observed it. He took the interesting twist of suggesting that, well, maybe the universe observed itself. And by observing itself, it brought itself into being. He even coined this. It's called it from bit. It's not quite as ear-catching as black hole, but I feel it's just as profound in its implications of the idea that that the it of the universe, comes from this single sort of this act of recursive self-observation. What John